the juxtaposition for the name of Ivan's book that's coming out next month is called Partitioning for Peace, an Exit Strategy for Iraq, and the relationship and the relevance of that to his Recarving Rushmore book is, of course, the growth of the centralized power in Washington through the presidency is exactly what he's also critiquing in this as far as Iraq is concerned. And the federal model, or the Confederacy model that the original republic was set up in, is really closer to what he's talking about as an approach that we should use here and elsewhere for other people. So thank you, Ivan. There's, of course, a great deal this book covers. It covers 40 presidents, and there's all sorts of areas that we can discuss in the Q&A, and I'm sure that will be brought up by our next speaker, whose name is, as you know, Andrew Rutten. Andrew is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science, as I mentioned, at Stanford University. He's associate editor of our journal, The Independent Review. He's been a national fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's been assistant professor of government at Cornell University, fellow at Liberty Fund, an Eland fellow in the School of Law at Columbia University. He's been associate editor of the journal Social Science History and visiting lecturer in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. He's contributed to many scholarly journals and many books. We're very pleased to have Andy Rutten.
Okay, so the title that I gave to this section is Good Government, Good Politics? And I think that one of the questions that we want to ask, stepping back a little bit from Ivan's book, is that we want to ask, is there, in a democracy, are politicians going to be able to succeed by promoting policies that lead to good government? Okay, and I have a caveat here that I always like to give at events like this, and this is from a little book called by George Washington Plunkett, who worked in Tammany Hall, called A Series of Very Plain Talks on Very Practical Politics. How many of you have read that book? I would urge that all of you, after, and I am deadly serious about this, I want to say more about this, but after you've read Ivan's book, I would urge you to look at Plunkett's book. You might want to look at it even before you read some P.J. O'Rourke, who I know David thinks very highly of, and I do too. And Plunkett, who was a politician, he said there's only one way to hold a district. You must study human nature and act accordingly. And then he went on and he said, you can't study human nature in books. Books is a hindrance more than anything else. If you have been to college, so much the worse for you. Okay, and I want to point out that Ivan's book actually proves that this is not true. Okay, this really, I can say this because I'm not David and I'm not Ivan, but this really is a remarkable book. Okay, I think that it better than any book that I've seen, that it effectively debunks the easy sentimentalism that both Ivan and David talked about, with which we regard our presidents. Okay, and this is the kind of book that even if every word in this book is wrong, including and the, it is a book that is worth reading, that is very much worth reading. Okay, and that's because Ivan raises very critical and important issues, and he deals with them in a very effective and readable fashion. Okay, and this is a very shocking book. Okay, I don't know, how many of you have had a chance to look at it? I would point out one of the most shocking things in here is that Jimmy Carter turns out to be a hero. I was surprised. He's rated even above Bill Clinton. Okay, and Clinton is rated above Reagan, and for good reason. So I think that this, I do really want to say that and I'm very serious about this. I think this is a very important book, and I would urge you all to read it. Okay, and it's the kind of book that you could sit down and read in an evening. I think that would be a mistake. I think it's the kind of book that you want to dip into, and because there are very subtle points that Ivan is making, and they're the kind of points that only come out if you look over a long period of time and wrap your mind around them. Okay, and after you've read Ivan's book, I would suggest you read Plunkett's book, which is online, so it's tempting. Okay, but read Ivan's book first. Okay, having said that, I want to dissent a little bit from what David and Ivan have said about the Imperial Presidency. David said that the presidency really is the federal government. And I, being a Congress guy, I want to suggest that that's not the case. I want to suggest that it's much better to talk about an imperial government, not an imperial presidency. And I think that once that Ivan himself throughout the book makes the point that presidents are part of a political system, and that often the things that they do are a response to what's happening elsewhere in the political system. Okay, and what I want to do in a little bit is show you some evidence that I think shows that the reason that Clinton did such a better job than George Bush, and that Bush did a better job when he was governor of Texas than he did when he was president of the United States, has to do with the constellation of political power around him. Okay, and I just want to start real quickly with what I consider to be the eternal question of politics. My Latin is terra. Is there anybody here who speaks Latin? The translation is, who will guard the guardians? Okay, it's from a satirical Roman poet, Juvenal. And the argument is very simple, right? It's that the story that we usually tell about why we need government is because human nature is such that people want to do bad things to other people. And in order to keep them from doing those bad things, we need to come together and organize a government. But the problem is that government is made up of the very people who are out doing those bad things to each other, right? You know, until the millennium comes, when the Messiah is going to reign, we're stuck with this problem that we have to rely on ordinary human beings to make up our government. And the classical solution to this, okay, next slide, was the good government requires good governors. Okay, and if you read the sort of classical political theory, that is the Greeks and Romans, and even actually parts of Machiavelli, there's a lot of emphasis on finding good governors. Okay, the modern solution, on the other hand, is a trick. And that is that if you can't beat them, join them. That is, what we should do is try to harness human nature through the process of institutional design. That is, we're going to create a set of institutions that are going to allow even people who are not good to behave well. And my favorite quote about this comes from the philosopher David Hume, in a little essay called On the Independence of Parliament. And he says, in contriving any system of government and fixing the several checks and controls of the Constitution, every man ought to be supposed a knave, and to have no other end in all his actions than private interest. And then Hume goes on, and so he says, we should assume that that human nature is corrupt. Very Protestant view. Okay, and then he says, by this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to public good. Without this, we shall in vain boast of the advantages of any constitution and find in the end that we have no security for our liberties or possessions except the goodwill of our rulers. That is, we shall have no security at all. Okay, and this is the whole, okay, so the next slide. There's an American version of this, which we all learned in high school, right? And that is the version of checks and balances. The notion that we have a system of separated powers, that is 3 branches that specialize, but that what makes America great is that we have managed to figure out a way to preserve that system, and the way we do that is by giving each branch a little bit of control over the other branches. Okay, and here's this beautiful letter from John Adams to Samuel Adams, which is on, Samuel Adams has written to John Adams, and he said, I think in the New Republic we need to have education. And his cousin writes back and says, education isn't going to work. And he says, it won't work because human appetites, passions, prejudices, and self-love will never be conquered by benevolence and knowledge alone, introduced by human means. I left out, he goes on and says, when the Messiah comes, this will happen, but that's not relevant here. Okay, because we're not talking about government by the Messiah. But he goes on, so notice he, like Hume, says that we have to take people as they are. Okay, and then he says, the numbers of men in all ages have preferred ease, slumber, and good cheer to liberty when they have been in competition. This is John Adams, President of the United States, okay? We must not then depend alone upon love of liberty in the soul of man for its preservation. Some political institutions must be prepared to assist this love against enemies. Without these, the struggle will ever end only in a change of impostors. Okay? This book is a catalog of impostors. Okay, and I want to say that there is actually a very interesting puzzle, which Ivan talks about early in the book, and that is that the early presidents are filled with people who write things like this and then perform very badly. I think Ivan picks on James Madison. Probably not enough to my way of thinking, but I think it is a real puzzle, and it comes to, I think, something that I'm going to want to talk about in a bit. But so the modern version, that is the American version, in order for it to work, we have to have a robust and active Congress, right? Because that's going to be the main check against the president. And as we've heard today, one of the stories that people tell is that we now have an imperial presidency, where the president has taken all of the power that he's usurped power, okay? But I want to suggest that this is true as an observation. The president is doing a lot of things that the founders certainly didn't anticipate that he was going to do. But I think a big part of the reason he's doing that is because Congress is going along with this, okay? And that a lot of the blame has to lie with Congress. And I want to point out that Dwight Lee, an economist, once said that he loved me because I'm the only pessimist who could make him feel good, could cheer him up, I think is what he said. I want to point out my story is actually much more pessimistic than the imperial presidency story, okay? Because in the imperial presidency story, you just needed the right president, okay? I think the problem is that we need to have both the right president and the right Congress, okay? And that's a lot more people to elect. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so I would suggest that in the United States, and this is a quote from George Washington Plunkett, who said, "What's the Constitution among friends?" And I've called this, the eternal question 2.0. And Plunkett's point was that if everybody's on good terms, then checks and balances aren't going to work, okay? And so this suggests that the question we have to ask is, how can we preserve a robust system of checks and balances? And I want to point out that Ivan himself, when he was talking about the Obama administration's desire to kill these weapon systems, he said that there were a lot of vested interests that would oppose this, okay? I would just point out that those vested interests have access to power through Congress. Okay, so I don't think, I'm in the way that academics love to do, I'm turning this into a little street fight, right? It's an academic street fight, of course, so it's completely nerdy. But I want to point out that what I'm saying is not inconsistent with Ivan's story, okay? And so I don't, again, you need to read the book, okay? Because it really is, it shows you why this question is so important, right? Because when presidents have friends, and so what I'd like to do now is give some examples of presidents, when presidents have friends and presidents who've had friends, and point out the kind of wickedness that comes from that, okay? Next slide. Okay, so I just want to say a little bit about Barack Obama's political style. There was a nice series of articles in the Chicago Tribune, not a paper that's friendly to Obama. And they interviewed a woman who'd worked with him, and she said that the lesson she'd learned from him is whoever can help you reach your goal, that's who you work with. There are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. Okay? That sounds like nonpartisanship right there, right? That's a very nice definition that you're not going to draw distinctions on ideological grounds. You're gonna work with whoever you have to. And the second is a long quote from a guy named Saul Alinsky, who the kids in this room won't remember, but he was a very, very influential political activist in the 1960s. He wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, a practical primer for realistic radicals. Obama worked in Chicago in an organization that was modeled along Alinsky lines. Secretary Clinton wrote her senior thesis at Wellesley on Alinsky. So he's a very influential guy. And the book is actually, it's a beautiful book to read. Go to Borders and sit down and read it there because it gets pretty boring pretty quickly. But he starts off, he says, compromise is a key and beautiful word. Okay? And he then says, a free and open society is an ongoing conflict interrupted periodically by compromises, which then become the start for the continuation of conflict, compromise, and on ad infinitum. I would actually say a better word than a free and open society is a democratic society, right? Because a free and open society where there's maybe that these compromises are going against freedom, okay? And he says control powers based on compromises in our Congress and among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. I hope you guys were listening to that, okay? It's not just the president. He says, a society devoid of compromise is totalitarian. If I had to define a democratic society in one word, that word would be compromise. Okay, so Obama's political style is that of somebody who's willing to reach out across the aisle, find people to work with, do whatever he has to get stuff done. Alinsky, in a part of this that I left out, he says, look, you know, if you take a principled stand for 100% when you could get 30%, you're not helping anybody except your own moral conscience. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how many of you remember this? When George Bush said during the 1999 campaign, I'm a uniter, not a divider. I refuse to play that politics of putting people into groups and pitting one group against another. Does that sound like a description of the Bush administration in practice? No. Okay, well, what happened? Now, a cynic might say, well, only an idiot would believe something that a politician said during a political campaign. I'm a cynic. I would say that. Next slide. But what I would argue is that it's the politics that did it. Okay, I don't know if you can see the next slide, but the top slide shows the makeup of the Texas legislature when George Bush was governor. And the title says, Governor Bush had to be a uniter. That is, he had to work with Democrats. And as you can see, the bolded big things are, and that's the House and the Senate, shows you that he always had Democrats that he had to work with. Okay, the bottom slide says President Bush had to be a divider because for most of his time in office, he had Republican House and Senate. Okay, the bottom line says President Clinton had to be a uniter because for much of his time in office, he faced Republicans. Okay, in other words, divided government explains a lot of what's going on. Okay, and that the solution, it is the politics. Okay, under our system of government, in order to get things done, presidents have to go to Congress and members of Congress have to get the president to sign bills. Okay, I think a very nice example of this is the fact that you know, President Bush very seldom exercised the veto power. Okay, in fact, never. Now, is this because he was the imperial president and he could crack the whip and Congress did only what he wanted? Well, that's a plausible story. It's possible. Another possibility is that he knew that he needed Congress in the future, and so he wasn't going to make them mad. Okay, he knew that they were his Congress. I think the truth is a little bit of both, right? That if President Bush, because it was a Republican Congress, if he said, I'm going to veto this, they didn't bother passing it. Okay, and if Congress, the leaders of the House and Senate came to him and said, we really want this passed, and if you don't pass it, you're going to have trouble on other things you want. Okay, he went along. Okay, and I think a lot of the very egregious things that are, you know, mentioned in this book are things that were done because Congress was more than willing to give the president a blank check. Okay, so this suggests that for the Obama administration, bad for us, the Obama administration, because those numbers, you can't see them, they're too small, but the House and the Senate both are controlled by 59% by Democrats. That swamps the majorities that either that Bush or Clinton had. Okay, this means that President Obama, the real lesson, I think, is that if you want to be the kind of president who doesn't do extreme and foolish things, that the kind of people in your party, the wings of your party want you to do, you need to have divided government. The Obama administration, that to the extent that there is a lesson that they have learned from the previous administrations, is that when you control the House and the Senate, you can do a lot more. Okay? And from our perspective, from people who want limited government, from people who want good government, this is a problem. Okay? And this suggests that the Obama administration is going to be not a happy administration for people who want limited government. Okay, and I want to suggest that it's even worse. So next slide. This is a slide from a quote from James Madison from the 1790s on war and good government. He says, "Of all the enemies of public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies, debts, and taxes are known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people." Okay, and it goes on, he has a bunch more, and he ends by saying, "No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." I think you could substitute emergency for warfare in there, and that would still remain true. Okay, and that, so the Obama administration is in a particularly, as I would point out, like the early Roosevelt administration. Okay, President Obama has large majorities, and they're popular majorities. Okay, and he has a lot of public sentiment on his side because we are in an emergency. Okay, I think this is a formula for a perfect storm. Okay, and I think it's a perfect storm not only because, and I think that this will completely mitigate, just as George Bush went from being a uniter to a divider, right? Not because, I don't know anybody who thinks that George Bush was clever enough to run strategically and behave well in Texas so that he could become president, right? Nobody believes that he was that clever. I think it's rooted in the politics. Okay, and I think there is a real danger here. Okay, and you can see this here, right? That and I think that a lot of so I guess my suggestion would be that when you read this book and you read president, you might want to say regime or president in Congress. Okay, you might want to notice how many of the presidents who behave badly during war are presidents who have Congress on their side. Right? One who didn't, one president who actually understood this was Abraham Lincoln. Right? When he got to Washington, D.C. after being elected, he started his own political party. Okay, because he understood that Republicans in Congress were in a unique situation. Southerners, who were mostly Democrats, had all left Congress. So Congress was now artificially inflated. Republican control of Congress was artificially exaggerated. And Lincoln understood that he thought, like most people, the war wasn't going to last very long. And he knew that when he ran for president, Southerners would be voting again. And he wanted to establish a political identity separate from the members of Congress, who he thought were probably going to do crazy things. Okay? So again, my lesson, as I say, I think this is very consistent with what's in Ivan's book. So I don't want you to go away thinking, well, you know, he was saying read the book, but the real message was, you know, read Plunkett of Tammany Hall. That's not the real message. Okay? I do want to say, so the last slide. There is one way in which President Obama is different. Right? He did say, of course I inhaled, that was the point. Okay, but again, you know, my bet is, so he's now talking about revising the war on drugs, which I actually happen to think is the most destructive war that we've waged in the past since Vietnam. The human cost there is just huge, both domestically and in other countries. Okay, but it is also true that the war on drugs is so deeply embedded into the fiscal system of Congress that it's going to be very, very hard to undo. And my bet is that the president's initiatives against the war on drugs, I don't know if any of you have been following this, but members of Congress are speaking up very vociferously about this. Okay, and my prediction is that they will continue to do that and across party lines. Right, some of the biggest advocates of the war on drugs are Democrats. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. Thank you all, and